Good evening. Welcome back to another episode of What's Your Story? Tonight we have the pleasure of sitting down with Cape Porpoise resident Tom Putnam. You are a retired library director, so I could not wait to sit down and talk to you a little bit more about what you're retired, but wanting to hear a little bit more about where and how it all came to be. But first, we're going to start with where you grew up.
Yes. Well, first it's interesting because I was a library director at a political institution, and I don't mean to be too political here, but I wanted to start by just congratulating you again on being named Librarian of the Year.
Thank you very much.
Me, but I have only been back for full-time for a year, but we've been coming on weekends. But you've done so much for this community and this library, and we are all deeply appreciative.
Thank you very much.
So my family moved up here in 1972, and I was 9. We moved from Massachusetts. My dad worked for Blue Cross Blue Shield, and he got transferred to the Portland office.
Okay.
And then my mom, I'm the last of 4 children. And actually, when I was younger, she went back, to her credit, to get her master's in counseling, and she became the guidance counselor at Kennebunk High School.
Okay.
So, but we lived in Kennebunk, so I went to Kennebunk High School. And then I married someone from Kennebunk Port who actually lived right in this neighborhood, had her paper route in this neighborhood.
Oh, wow.
And then, so my family has all now moved up to Maine. Maine is home. I have a sister in Cape Porpoise, and my mother-in-law's in Cape Porpoise. So when my wife and I, her cousin built us a little house, and we are very happily back here.
I bet. Now, did you go to college in Maine?
I did. I went to Bowdoin College.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think I might have read that somewhere.
Yeah.
So, and then after that, you went on to...
It fits into the story we'll tell in a minute about being a library director. So I actually, after college, I did get a master's in public administration. And so I don't have training as a librarian, but when we talk about the library I directed, it's part of the federal government. So having a master's in public administration worked. But then I always thought I was going to be a high school teacher, high school history teacher. And I actually thought I might get involved in local politics. So I moved back and lived in my parents' house, and I actually was a history teacher at Thornton Academy.
Okay.
And that was the hardest job I've ever had, and really was a good education for me and appreciation for what teachers do.
Yeah,
I only lasted 2 years. And then I worked for Bowdoin College.
Okay.
They had a program that I had worked for in the summertime, which it's a federally funded program that comes out of the Kennedy-Johnson years, which also fits into my life story in a minute. That helps low-income high school students be the first in their families to go to college.
Oh, wow.
So the students that the Bowdoin program served were in Washington County and Aroostook County.
Okay.
So I was assigned those 2 counties, and I actually lived in Washington County. So I lived in Machias for 2 years. It's partly why my wife and I married when we did, because I was moving up there, and she moved up there with me. And just briefly, then from there we moved to Western Massachusetts because Phyllis was getting her graduate degrees, and she started out at Mount Holyoke and then got her doctorate at UNH. And then over time, I used to take those students, the upward bound students, to Boston in the summertime, and we would always go to the Kennedy Library because that's the program out of which this program they were in. And so anyway, I did Upward Bound just for 2 years at Bowdoin, and then for 8 years out in Western Massachusetts. So a total of 10 years of doing that work, and then the Director of Education job opened up at the Kennedy Library. So that's how I ended up at the Kennedy Library.
Wow. I've never been, which I need to go.
We could do a community trip. I don't know
We
if I do it with
definitely
you
could.
or the senior center, but I'd be happy to take people
I
down.
think that would be, what do you think, Mike Kelly, our producer? I think we are on a mission.
The Rotary group, so one kind of sweet story, the Rotary gives out a scholarship every year, and I was the inaugural recipient of the Rotary Scholarship, always deeply indebted to the Rotary for helping me to go to college. So they came down one year when I was director of the Kennedy Library. It was kind of
how
sweet.
nice.
Yeah.
That would be a fun. That would be a fun program to coordinate.
Yeah.
We'll have to talk more about
Sure.
that.
Be happy to do it.
So, so when you were there, I've seen talks, you know, like on C-SPAN or you know, different things like that. It looks like a really beautiful space. Those big windows and what would be a typical day for you while you were working there?
Sure. Well, first, let me just explain to folks that the way the presidential library system works is it started under Franklin Roosevelt. He was the first. So before, I won't go into too many details, but for years, the papers of the president belonged to the president. And it was Franklin Roosevelt who said, well, they really should belong to the American people. So he created a lovely small library in Hyde Park, New York, adjacent to his boyhood home.
Yeah.
And then after that, every other president followed the lead. Now, JFK was different since he died in office, so his family picked this spot. And it's right on the ocean, and that's why it's, and Jacqueline Kennedy chose I.M. Pei to be the architect, and so it is one of the jewels of his larger oeuvre. And so I was the director of education, then eventually I became director of the library. And again, because it's part of the National Archives, I mean, it's somewhat in the news, and I don't want to get into the controversies about President Trump and his papers, but the presidential library system, that is the system that works with the president when they're in the White House.
Okay.
And to be sure that they're properly protecting the papers and classifying them.
Right.
And then when the president leaves office, then the papers go to the National Archives. So in the Kennedy Library case, they went to a warehouse for a while until they built this beautiful library on Columbia Point. So it's in Boston, but it's in the part of Boston called Dorchester, and it's right on the ocean.
Yeah.
And then it's called a library. It's the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum. So there are different facets to it. So it's really more of an archives than a library, but the word archives kind of is a little off-putting to people who want to come visit.
Yeah, it's almost like don't come.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But the real center of it is the actual archives with all of the papers and all of the artifacts and all of the audiovisual materials. And so researchers come there. But there is a room that's open to the public, and there are books, but they're primarily books about, it's not a lending library, but they're reference books and biographies of JFK.
Right.
And then there's the museum that's open to the public. And then there's educational programs like the forums that you saw, or school groups come in and go through the museum.
Yeah.
So initially I was director of education, so I oversaw those programs, and then I was the library director. You know, it's somewhat administrative, as you know. Part is the fun part of your job here, and then there's part of managing budgets and personnel and security. Again, related to the controversies people have read about President Trump, we had one of these things called a SCIF, where we have classified documents there, and people say, well, what could be classified, you know, back from the 1960s? Well, there are, say, the identities of CIA, you know, whose children would still be alive, and they could be. There are actually not nuclear secrets per se, but there's materials in presidential libraries about how we built nuclear bombs back then, which you wouldn't want. So there are documents that you want to remain classified.
Yeah.
So anyway, it was a fascinating job. I got to meet all kinds of people. I met all types of former presidents, and yeah, it was a lot of fun.
So as far as getting speakers to come, were you were part of that?
Yeah, that was one of my main things.
So how would you go about that? Because that's something that I do.
Yeah.
And people will say, how did you get so-and-so? And I just asked.
Exactly, yeah.
But sometimes we get lucky. We get somebody like really special.
Or you get someone in town who knows someone.
Exactly.
So that you get your foot in the door a little bit.
Yeah.
Well, actually, there's a nice local story related to that. So when I first arrived at the library as the director of education, it was around 2000. And I was there at an interesting moment when it was kind of the passing of the guard. So the first group of staff tend to be people who worked for President Kennedy, and then he dies in office, and then they're looking for a job, and they love President Kennedy. So our curator was a guy named Dave Powers, who was, but I was there at the time when we moved from those people to more professionally trained folks. But also when I was first there, it was it was all rah-rah JFK, and all we do is talk about JFK. And it was like, it's time to expand. So I said, do you ever invite former presidents, and do you ever invite presidents from the other party? And they said, well, we've never done that. And I said, well, I have a small connection with President George H.W. Bush, and if I invited him, would you come? They said, sure. So I wrote the letter. But now the important point here, and this is the point we were just making, I will take credit for the idea, but we had Caroline Kennedy sign the letter.
Oh.
And that's a very interesting thing, in that we all know that President Bush lost a daughter at a very young age, and that's a important part of who he was as a person. And so he had incredible sympathy for a daughter who lost her father.
Oh.
And people said that he would do anything for Caroline Kennedy.
Oh, my goodness.
One thing that's funny, he always called her Carolyn. Not always, but we have to remind him it's Caroline. And so he got the invitation, and he had one stipulation, and he said, I'll come, but Caroline Kennedy needs to, I'll do anything for Caroline Kennedy. So we had to write, so she wasn't there for all of our events. She did sign a number of other letters, but so it was my very first year, and it was kind of this kind of coup. And then it was the first, this is kind of another funny story. This is the first event my wife and I went to, I was in my mid-30s, and they had this kind of fancy brunch. He wanted to come around 2 in the afternoon, so we had like a brunch, and then he was interviewed by this famous journalist, John Siegenthaler. And so Phyllis and I went to the brunch, and we got our little cards, and we were just tickled pink to be there. But what we realized was we were put at the kids' table. So we were with Caroline Kennedy's kids, who weren't particularly well behaved. So, but we still felt kind of happy to be there. But it was just kind of a funny thing to realize that we're partly here to babysit and make sure that the kids are okay.
That is so funny.
Yeah,
oh my gosh.
So, but you're right. So. But then later, like I invited President Carter once. He actually ends up coming twice during my tenure, and Mrs. Carter. And it was interesting because people said, as we all know, President Carter in 1980 was challenged by Senator Edward M. Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's younger brother. And there was acrimony because many people felt like it hurt him, and then he lost against Ronald Reagan. And some of this is just maybe rumors, but someone said, he's gotten over it, but actually Mrs. Carter still, has a little bit. But they both accepted my invitation, and she came and talked about, mental health issues, and mental health. And then, so President Carter came, and I got to bring my son, and we have this picture of my son and President Carter. And he of all the presidents, of all the people I met, I mean, it really is true. He's a very, very decent person, very humble. And,
seems like it from, from all
and then the other real perk of the job is I was able to travel quite a bit. So as library directors, we would go to different libraries. So we'd get tours from the Johnson daughters of the, President Johnson had his boyhood home that he would go to, or I met Nancy Reagan out at the Reagan Library, and that was a lot of fun things like that. And actually, the Carter Library, they renovated the library, their museum, and we were all invited down to the grand opening. We got a personal tour of the Carter Presidential Library with President and Mrs. Carter. It was very, very special. Oh, wow. Yeah.
Have you ever been to the Bush Library?
I have.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I know when that opened, there were a lot of folks that from here went.
Yeah, who went, I had heard that President and Mrs. Bush made sure that they came down. And then I had missed it, but they had an exhibit about Kennebunkport down in their museum. I think they collaborated with a brick store, maybe the library here too. And it's each library is a little bit different, and they each take on the persona. It's not surprising. I tend to like there are a number of them that are near boyhood homes, or like you go to Independence, Missouri, and you see the home that Harry and Bess Truman lived in after he was president. But the other thing that can be very moving, not all of them have this, but many of them also are the burial places. So in President Bush's case, so you actually, when I went, he was still alive, but I think their daughters, they had already reinterred their daughter, and now President Bush is there, and Mrs. Bush and their daughter, and so kind of, so when you're, but the same thing, Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt are buried at theirs. Harry and Bess Truman are buried. I think President Nixon is buried out at his. Yeah, that's interesting to experience them.
So you talked about, how this all got started. Did anybody go back and form libraries for previous presidents?
The only one who did that was Herbert Hoover.
Okay.
And then I think others, I don't know where the Woodrow Wilson papers are. There's a Woodrow Wilson home. But most of them had already, so the reason why Hoover did it was he was still alive. So
okay.
He actually outlived Harry Truman, I think. So he had donated all of his papers to Stanford. And then when he saw this, he built one in West Branch, Iowa.
Okay.
So now the system, we say, goes from Herbert Hoover. Now, after I left the Kennedy Library, I actually oversaw the entire system for a couple of years.
Wow.
So I would always say Herbert Hoover to Barack Obama. The Obama one is being built in Chicago, and I went out to the warehouse where all of his papers and saw some of the drafts of his speeches.
Yeah.
Now I think they say through Donald Trump, because if you go to the National Archives website, there is like a website about the Donald Trump Library, but he, obviously because he's running again, hasn't even thought about if he ever will have a library or where it would be.
That makes sense.
Most former presidents don't run again, so then they are focused on their legacy.
Right, right.
Things like that. So the most recent one is George W. Bush's library. It's the biggest, I think, and it's really pretty impressive. And it's in Dallas at Southern Methodist University. And President and Mrs. Bush live in Dallas, and they have their working offices, and they have a foundation that does a lot of good in the world that they do out of their library.
Yeah, pretty incredible. That's another trip we need to coordinate.
That would be fun. They'd probably welcome us warmly down there.
So now that you're retired, what do you like to do? You get up every day, you're in a beautiful town.
I am.
Bike, any?
That's that, but I just might just say, after I oversaw all the presidential libraries, I was in that job, and it was kind of a bureaucratic job. So before I retired, I did one last stint that was quite interesting, and I directed. So I like to do these kind of forums and put exhibits together. And when I kind of took that promotion, that actually took me out of that world. So I got a really fascinating job at a small history museum in Concord, Massachusetts.
Okay.
But that town is so iconic, both for the Battle of Lexington and Concord, and then for the Transcendentalists. And that might be another trip that would be fun to take people to Concord, because it's such a beautiful town.
It really is.
So I was there during the pandemic, and then Phyllis and I ended up spending the pandemic here because it was safer. Her cousin had built us this little house, and I was commuting down, and then that just got a little bit hard, and then Phyllis ended up getting a job up here. I love to walk, so my mom's been a little bit sick, so I haven't walked as much, but for a while this spring I was actually walking about 10 miles a day.
Oh, wow. Good for you.
Yeah. And
beach or road?
I do both.
Both?
In the wintertime, I do the beach because it's a little safer.
Yeah.
And then I love walking from our house down various back roads over to the pier and back and Cape Porpoise.
Yeah.
I do some writing, so I've written some op-eds for like the Portland Press Herald and Bangor Daily
Oh, that's
News.
great.
Yeah, and
That's great.
I oddly went to divinity school for a year. I could say proudly that I'm a Harvard Divinity School dropout, but I like to preach, and the local Unitarian church over in Sanford is without a minister right now, so I preach over there once a month, which
That's great.
It's kind of fun.
Yeah.
And then I'd like to write a book. And I'm doing the research on it. The idea wouldn't be like original research, but it would be about, so I don't think of myself as a native Mainer since I moved here when I was 9. But it would be about 3 other people who weren't originally from Maine, but who came to Maine and were transfixed by its beauty and then wrote about it. So it would be Henry David Thoreau, E.B. White, and Rachel Carson. And a book that would kind of bring the 3 together. And then if I ever wrote it, then I'd love to come to little local libraries and talk about those 3 people in there.
We would love that.
So anyway,
That's a great idea.
Yeah.
That's a great idea.
And then I just joined I noticed you had Tom Bradbury as one of your guests here, so I just joined the board of the trust. And
Yeah.
I've actually been kind of really thrown myself into that. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of good things happening
There, oh
there.
my gosh, there's so many good things happening. And he really, as far as what has been done in this town, preservation-wise.
It's unbelievable.
It really is.
Yeah.
It really is amazing.
Yeah. Phyllis and I
So-
love, for instance, we love to go. Well, the other night we have kayaks. We live near Paddy Creek, not on the water, but we can walk down. And so we kayaked out to one of the islands and had a lovely picnic dinner.
That's
and,
wonderful.
We love to go over to Timber Point, which was in
Yep.
private hands when we grew up in town.
Yeah.
And now it's such a beautiful
Yeah.
spot. So anything we can do to support that.
That's great.
effort. Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
So as we get ready to wrap up,
Yep.
we like to do a one-word answer.
Sure.
Ready
Happy
for
to.
that?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So favorite flavor of ice cream?
Coffee Heath Bar
Okay.
at Big Daddy's.
Oh, at Big Daddy's. Okay. Good. Favorite movie?
Oh, that's a hard one. Shoot. Let me pass and I'll think
Okay.
about it as you ask me another
Okay.
question.
The coolest place you've ever been in the world?
Well, first I'll just. I love that movie Brooklyn it's based on Colm Toybeans.
Yep.
And I met Colm Toybean.
That
and
is a great.
I'm Irish,
yeah.
so
Yeah.
I don't know if it's my favorite movie, but I do love that movie.
That is a good one.
Well, it's funny, just the other day, so my wife works at the landing school, and they had this presentation of people who sailed around the world, and they went by Dakar, Senegal. So I had a Fulbright in West Africa, and I didn't make it all the way out to Timbuktu, but I was very close. There's this town called Djenné, but
Okay.
in the Dogon country. So it's probably, in terms of exotic places,
Yeah.
the interior of West Africa is
Yeah.
probably the most exotic that I've been to.
That sounds pretty. That sounds pretty cool. Favorite restaurant?
Well, Joshua's, but it's closed.
I
so,
know. I know.
So
We're also bummed about that.
I just made reservations for our anniversary at the Tides.
Oh, nice. Okay. Have you? So as far as best restaurant, another place that's like not around here, somewhere in the world that you've been that you just say, I have to go back there someday.
For a restaurant?
Yeah.
I think it's called Oleana. There's this lovely one in Boston, and it's kind of Mediterranean
Okay.
tapas. There's also, so we raised our kids in Arlington, Massachusetts, and there's a very, very nice Indian restaurant called Punjab, and that's where our family used to go for
Okay.
family events. So it has a lot of personal meaning.
Well,
for
that's
us.
good. See, we like to learn about other places too. And you have, is it two
Two
kids?
kids,
Two
yeah.
kids? Boy and a girl?
Yeah.
Okay.
And our children are adopted. Our son's from Guatemala, and our daughter's from South Korea.
Wow. And do they live here with
My
you?
son's
Are
in
they...
Portsmouth, and
Okay.
our daughter's in community college in Boston.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Do you get to see them often?
Yeah. We saw our son on Sunday, and our daughter's coming up in 2 weekends. It's my mother's 96th birthday. So
Wow.
yeah.
Oh,
we
how-
love that down east. The down easter is a perfect way to get
Really
her
is.
up and back.
Yeah, it really is. So if somebody were in town and you were at the post office, say, and they wanted to know something, we only have a day, what should we do here in Kennebunkport? So I get asked that question a lot when I'm walking downtown
Right,
for
right.
something, and people will say, what should we do here today? We're here for the day.
Yeah. Well, I'll answer it, but in a slightly sideways. So at the museum that I used to work at in Concord, museums are always, as you do effectively here, looking to raise money. So we had one of the silent, I don't know, it was a regular auction, a live auction. And oftentimes what people like is not so much things, but experiences.
Right.
So they asked me, would you do a day tour in Kennebunkport, for 4 people, and I said sure. So it was very nice. They had a bidding war, and
How cool!
I think people paid like $1,200, if you could imagine, to spend
That
a
is
day
great.
with me in Kennebunkport. And then I didn't know the auctioneer was going to do it, but it was a smart thing to do when they were right at the 1,200 mark,
Yeah,
he
yeah.
said to me, "Would you do both?" And I said, "Of course." So we made 2,400.
Double the money.
Yeah, 2,000
Yes,
$400.
we like that.
So the one group just came up, and so I just I started actually at Rachel Carson in Wells because I wanted them to understand a little bit of the Native past, and to me that's the interesting place to tell that story. So I used Joyce Butler's incredible book. I went to high school with her son Jim.
Yeah.
And I haven't read it cover to cover yet, but I do read 2 or 3 pages a day.
Oh, it's so easy to just open a page
exactly.
and get something out of it. Yeah.
So we just stayed by the coast, and then I tried to tell. It was a history museum, so I tried to give a bit of a history tour. So then, of course, we came downtown to talk about the shipping world,
Right.
and then we went over by the River Club and walked over there to understand the tourist industry, and then, of course we went to the Bush compound. Then I wanted them to see the lobstering community, so we went to the pier.
That's great.
And then we ended up at the Tides for lunch, and then I brought them back over to the boathouse by the old grist mill.
Nice.
So that was kind of a loop. So that's what I did with the group that was
Okay,
here
well,
for the day.
we might be having to hit you up, Mr. Putnam, for a little fundraiser.
No, I would be happy to do the same thing of taking people to Concord or
That is so great.
Yeah.
Yeah. That
so-
would be fun to do, though, a trip if we could go to the library sometime.
Yeah, it'd be fun.
Get a little bus.
I think I said I was not a good classroom teacher because I was terrible with discipline and classroom management. But I do actually I think of myself as an educator,
Yeah.
even though most of the jobs I had were more administrative. But I like to, I'm happy, I have a little bit of knowledge. I'm happy to try to impart it to other people. So
That's
when I
great.
can, yeah.
Well, thank you so much for
Sure.
being on
Thank
our
you.
show. It was really nice to get to know you a little bit better and hear about what you did and
Great.
what you're still doing, really.
Yeah.
So thank you.
I should say the other thing that I do incessantly is read. So I love libraries. And, so,
Yeah, I just got being part of a project, and somebody said, "Oh my God, you must read all the time." I actually don't.
Yeah.
I wish I had more time.
Yeah.
Someday.
Yes.
Someday.
Yeah.
So.
That's what retirement is for.
Okay. All right. Good. Thank you.
Sure.
Really.
Thank you.
And thank you all for being with us tonight. Thanks to our producer, Mike Kelly. And hopefully we'll see you back here next time on What's Your Story?